So today we're going to be welcoming Dr. Julian Watkins, who is the Acting Assistant Commissioner of the Bureau of Health Equity Capacity Building at the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. We're really happy to have him. We've worked with him in the past, and we're going to be talking today about cultural competency.
Really happy to be here and share this presentation, talk about cultural competency. I also kind of call it cultural humility at a time where I think it's really important when we look at what's going on socially and politically around folks who are in LGBTQIA communities. So, this presentation, for a little background, was created in response to the Mpox outbreak that happened over the summer and the second half of 2022. New York City was an epicenter, and I think it was a great time to reflect and review and kind of update our knowledge and our understanding of the communities as they were affected by this contagious virus that was unfairly or unequally affecting folks in these communities. We want to share some important definitions, update our language, understanding things can change, our understandings change, the language that we employ, really can change over time. So just kind of update us. We all come from different experiences and just, offer some baseline stuff, discuss some relevant cultural practices within the community to really increase a more comprehensive and holistic understanding of the health needs of the communities in the LGBTQ broader community. And we also just want to raise awareness to the diversity of experience, the rich and beautiful diversity of experience within the LGBTQ community, and make sure that we understand, we talk about cultural humility, there's multiple cultures that exist, subcultures, et cetera, that exist within the community. We want to make sure that we have an awareness of the distinct histories and practices. To start the presentation, I always like to bring up this quote. This is a quote that I became familiar with, early in my training, and it comes from Dr. Elon Meyer. This was published, over 20 years ago, which is wild to think, but it was published in the year 2001 from a special issue of the American Journal of Public Health. This was the journal's first issue dedicated to the health of LGBT persons in the journal's 91-year history. So Dr. Meyer goes on to, in this quote, to state that LGBT persons that they vary in social demographic characteristics such as cultural, ethnic, and racial identity. They also vary by age, education, income, and place of residence. They are also diverse in the degree to which their LGBT identities are centered to their self-definition, their level of affiliation with other LGBT people, and their rejection or acceptance of societal stereotypes and prejudice. So basically what that says is, everyone's different. Within the various different communities, many are represented. Some actually, may identify with, some may not identify with the larger community. And I think this is really to understand the diversity held within the, this bigger umbrella term, to really just start from the beginning to name and state that there are differences. And the differences don't have to be a point of tension. They can actually be something that we can celebrate and further understand. So why the update? So as I mentioned earlier, New York City in the second half of 2022, we had a major outbreak. We were a global epicenter for Mpox. Mpox is a virus that had been identified in the 20th century. There's been various outbreaks in other parts of the world. A few cases had been previously identified in the States, but this outbreak that hit New York City and the whole world in the summer, starting in the summer of 2022, definitely took a different model or a different kind of course. The transmissions were mostly to certain social networks. The people who are mostly affected were people in the social and sexual networks of folks who identify as gay or bisexual men who have sex with men. But, understanding how the networks are big and inclusive, a lot of other folks who may not identify as men were also infected or may have been part of some of these networks. Why did New York City become an epicenter? I think when we are the biggest and I would say greatest city in the United States. We have the largest population of folks who identify as LGBTQ. If something's happening in other parts of the world, chances are things can definitely end up here in New York City. And I think that when we look at the history of the LGBTQ community in our city, it's a long and storied history. Members of the community have a large cultural footprint, locally, when thinking about the folks in the community and the impact in our local scene, but also thinking nationally and the way that folks from the community represent our city and also represent the community broadly, and then even globally. And I think that, as the language and culture shifts over time, it's always great great to have an update and kind of like a check-in and just really unpacking sexual orientation and gender identity. I think that we hear a lot of conversation around these things, and we see, some folks have politicized to these things, but I think it's just really important to know, from a public health standpoint and from a human standpoint, all people have a sexual orientation and a gender identity. The way that folks describe it, the way that folks understand it can vary from person to person, culture to culture. And I think that it's really important to name and acknowledge that people are not fixed, that people can, that their understanding and the way that they identify can change over time. I think that the biggest things to understand and unpack is that a person's sexual orientation does actually not equal their gender identity. It's a lot more layered and nuanced. So when we're thinking about sexual orientation, I think there's three main dimensions to a person's sexual orientation. And just to really unpack dimension by dimension, I think it's really important to really understand what it means and how one can impact the other, and how the overlap is this thing that we describe as our sexual orientation. So starting from the top, if you see in that yellow box, attraction or desire, that is the attraction of an individual to other folks. Who are they attracted to? That is one of the components, and that can inform someone's sexual orientation or how they are oriented. Their sexual attraction or desire is definitely something that is often internal. You don't really know what a person's attraction or desire may be. When we look at the external, behavior is one of them. So what kind of behaviors do folks engage in? Is someone acting on same sex or same gender attractions? Is someone not acting on them? The behavior is like how someone acts upon the attraction or the desire. And when we look at identity is how someone identifies. Do they personally identify with, some of these existing kind of, group identities? Does a male identified person who has same-sex attraction, do they identify as gay? Do they identify as queer? How do they identify? And so the identity piece, I think, is one component, because some folks, back to the quote from the beginning, some folks may identify with some of these larger groups, but some folks may not. For some folks, they may not be a big part of who they are, just maybe, who they're attracted to or the types of behavior that they engage in. I think it's really just to understand that, our sexual orientation, it can vary based on time, understanding, and then level of comfort or safety. So I wanted to just name, as we kind of get into that, how the Mpox outbreak really demonstrated how this changing tides are important, and how it's really important to kind of update our understanding and even the language. So when we first saw the outbreak starting in New York City or across the world, there was this historical behavioral category that kind of started to come up, that's called men who have sex with men. It was been out in the HIV literature since at least the year 1990. So, this is over 30 years old. An acronym itself, MSM, was shortened. It's been in the literature since 1994. MSM, it refers to behaviors of male identified folks who are having sex with other men, but it's not an identity. Most folks who engage in a male to male loving behavior don't necessarily identify as an MSM. But I think part of it make a distinction at the early time to not stigmatize folks in the community when referring to HIV. But now, as we kind of see identity and orientation and things, the language has expanded and we see a lot more diversity. We see that category doesn't really capture the entirety of folks who are in those networks, or folks who may engage in some of these similar behaviors. And the reality is, a lot of folks who engage in MSM, or men who have sex with men behavior, may not identify as any of these kind of umbrella terms. And so finally, when we unpack and what we're getting at, we really want to make sure that when we're talking about the community, that we're not using blanket statements and really taking away the fact that the identity does matter, that there is a lesbian or a gay or a queer or bi identity, and that comes with it. And there are community networks and relationships within these pairings that are really important and go and extend beyond just sexual behavior. And I think it helps us have a more rich and true understanding of the community versus just categorizing, the variety of people who may engage in a certain type of behavior, but may not actually live or occupy some of the same spaces. Now we're getting to gender identity. So we kind of talked about sexual orientation, but when we talk about gender identity and expression, this is something distinct and separate, but can be impacted by our sexual orientation. When we think about gender identity, this is a person's internal sense of their gender. Unlike their gender expression, identity is internal. It's not outwardly expressed or visible to others. behaviors. When we're talking about expression, this is the external expression or manifestation of how someone is outwardly presenting. Important to note that the way someone outwardly presents may not actually align with the way that someone may perceive them or the way that they perceive themselves. But it's really just thinking about how someone presents themselves through their behavior, but also clothing, mannerisms, speech, etc. Both of these can change over time. But I think it's really important to understand, culturally, even for folks who identify as heterosexual, folks who who may not identify in the LGBTQ community. If we think about society and these socially generated cues, we look across cultures, certain behaviors are acceptable even amongst folks who identify as, straight or hetero, but certain behaviors may be more acceptable in certain countries where men may have more intimate touch or affection. Two men identified folks can walk hands and be straight in some country, but in another place, be attacked. So it's just really understanding that these cultural expressions vary, across all different types of identities and expressions. So when we name gender identity, I think there's a big point that has been really politicized, and folks who have been under a lot of scrutiny and attack are folks who identify in the trans community. We've seen an increase, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, in just the politicization of folks who are trans experience. So we really just want to name, as members of the LGBTQ community, that folks with trans identity, is really important to really understand and let folks who are trans really name themselves to receive the care that they need. So we talk about trans, this is someone who has a sex that is assigned at birth that may not align with how they identify with their gender. When we talk about cisgender, this is cis, this is someone whose their current gender identity aligns with the identity that they were assigned at birth. We see that the majority of folks have this alignment, but there are a lot of folks who don't. And when we think about intersex, I don't want to conflate intersex identity with someone who's a trans experience, but when we're thinking about gender identity, it's important to know that folks who are intersex exist, and the differences that folks may have may be a difference in their reproductive anatomy or their chromosomes or how their hormones are working, that they may not fit these typical definitions of male or female. And just really understanding that there is a history of actually folks, young children who are born intersex, who receive, surgical interventions, in really, really early in life, and just naming that it's not this foreign thing where we think about surgical interventions around gender identity. Really, when we talk about the LGBTQ community, I think a big push that comes from the community is really of people kind of living beyond the binary, understanding that there's such a rich diversity in human identity, orientation, and behavior. And we're really just leaving, kind of these older ways of seeing and understanding folks, and making space for the fact that, with 8 billion people, there's 8 billion ways that folks can relate to each other and be in a relationship. So when we talk about gender expansiveness, this is an adjective that can be used to describe someone who with a gender identity that may be beyond the male-female gender binary. Non-binary is another term that's used by folks who don't describe themselves or their genders are fitting within the binary. Some folks may be along the spectrum, but some folks may be way beyond the spectrum. And then agender, wanted to name that there are some folks who describe themselves as not having any gender and just kind of identify as, as a person. I've heard it said, that gender is a spectrum. And we think about spectrums, we kind of think about a straight line, but I like it. I've heard people kind of say that gender is more of a constellation. So it's a lot more three-dimensional, and there's different, it looks different ways. Like the Milky Way is different than, a point A to point B. Why does this even matter? Well, I think if you look at where things are headed, this is where the society is heading. We think about there's more expansiveness, there's more diversity. And so we have to really respond, in the moment and be aware of the tides are changing. And the reality is, sexual and gender minority folks have been engaged in advocacy for many years with the right to name themselves and how people describe themselves in the public discourse. And I think that the goal when we're talking about health equity and the work that we do is to really have a expanded understanding of gender in these conversations, and really focusing on inclusion and making sure that our language that we use is inclusive and reflects people's lived experiences. If you look on the screen to the right, this is just a screenshot from a Gallup poll, so a big poll that was conducted, I want to say in the year 2020, 2020, and just, just taking a survey of folks and breaking it down by the different generational groups. So as you can see in the column to the middle, folks, a percentage of respondents who identify as LGBT. You can see that for folks in the Gen Z generation, so this is folks born in the late 90s to the early 2000s, nearly 16% of folks identified as being members of the LGBT community. Look at folks in my generation, folks who identify as millennials, folks born between 81 and 96, around 9% of folks. And you kind of see subsequent generations, less folks had identified, but it's just, if you want to look where the trend is going, more folks are identifying. So we just really want to, understand and be sure that we, in public health, but also, as, citizens and folks living in the community, that a lot of that, people identify as gay, queer, all these different ways, and really to, keep up with the time to know where folks are going versus always just resisting, any kind of change or deviation. So now we'll talk about language and the fact that language does matter. This is not an extensive list at all, but I wanted to include this table just to name and acknowledge language is changing all the time. Some folks find different language that resonates with them, and something that they may use to describe themselves may, technically be like outmoded or may kind of be different than what people are using at the time. But it's important to just know that you got to meet people where they are. If someone is identifying themselves or naming themselves in a way, you want to make sure that you mirror that. You're going to be respectful and kind of really follow their lead. Every so often, you see some LGBTQ advocacy groups that kind of release these kind of glossaries and kind of, provide an update of where we are now. But I think the main goal is that we're really trying to get to, people first language, making sure that we describe, a person with XYZ or a person of such and such experience versus, pathologizing or kind of summarizing or wrapping someone up, as like just being this thing, like, oh, that's a trans. And it's like, no, this is a person of trans experience, or like, oh, this is a biological this or that versus no, this is someone who was assigned this gender at birth. They had no say in it. Some doctor or someone saw what was going on between their legs and, made this assignment. And so when we think about pronouns or other things, we really want to just make sure that we're acknowledging the autonomy of folks. These are someone's pronouns. It's not like they're preferred or they're suggested. Like this is how they present, or we think about someone's orientation. This is how they're oriented versus, oh, this is their preference, So just really making sure that we use language that is affirming folks and their autonomy as people and full humans.
And I just want to mention too, I think this chart is really helpful because it allows for the kind of diversity, the language allows for the diversity that you were describing. So the diversity that we see in the community that is, sort of limitless is like, there's these combinations of words that can help to do justice, I guess, to that diversity.
The main takeaway from the fact is that nobody knows all the things. Some people living in the communities and kind of are up to date on some of the lingo or how people are doing it, but like, it's okay if you're not up to date on all of the things, right? Yeah. But the biggest thing is, how do you approach it, right? If you go with an open heart or mind and like, I want to learn, I want to do right, I want to be better, there's things that we can do to kind of get ourselves there. There's a way to engage with folks, and we may not know all the things, but to do it in a humble kind of way and like follow someone's lead. I think that's the core of what we're trying to get at versus like go home and memorize all the different ways that people currently are like, it definitely give yourself a heart attack, a lot of stress trying to do all that. But just really, how are you coming from? And with an open and accepting mind, I think that's kind of how we can stay on top of that language and be open to be corrected or learn something new.
And I think to note too is like, this is not people sort of within the LGBTQIA community are learning new language all the time too. It's not like that it's a sort of insider outsider thing. This language changes really fast. So it can be difficult for anybody to keep up with it. I think what you're saying, Dr. Watkins, too, is like to be open to listening to people's lived experience.
So speaking of lived experience, I think naming that there is a diversity of experience. When we think about, the community, often I think historically we kind of think about the community in a very particular way. We think Stonewall, we think, the pride marches and people on floats and stuff. But really, it's important to consider, that there is such a rich diversity. When we think about intersectionality, there's a phrase or this way of understanding that, many people have many different identities. Someone what is their gender identity? What is their national identity? What is their ethnic identity? What is all of these different identities, and who and how do they identify? And just knowing that some of these identities are created by the society. There's these layered things that have kind of generated these identities, and sometimes they may be associated with certain types of disadvantages. The society may look down on certain folks for various reasons, unfair, or also some folks certain identities may actually be advantages. Some things may actually work in someone's favor. Again, not something that someone has done or necessarily deserves more than anyone else, but it's important to know that. And that some of these things can impact health and well-being. And I think that it's important to name that interaction across different social communities. It's still, to this day, can be limited due to social segregation. So just understanding that we're talking about the community, the LGBTQIA community, it's not just this one community, it's an amalgamation, or it's a lot of other distinct communities. Sometimes there's overlap and intersection, but sometimes there's not. Sometimes the priorities may not align, but we want to make sure that we name and understand that the community is bigger and broader. So to the right included this, an updated pride flag folks may have seen around. If you look to the right of the screen, that classic rainbow from rainbow flag. But in 2018, there was an update, and I think it really important that came from the graphic designer Daniel Quasar, and they included the black and brown bars to represent folks in the black and brown community, black and brown folks who identify as LGBTQIA, and they also identified the colors of the trans pride flag to include folks to really center and name trans folks, folks with trans experience in the broader LGBTQIA community. So again, just really like naming and understanding that we're talking about a lot of people and a lot of different backgrounds and experiences when we're talking about the community. So that said, there are unique social spaces and networks that I think that we should name and understand that are associated with particular groups. But I think that's just important too, to kind of show the resilience that the groups have had. Some of these unique social spaces, such as like the ballroom or Kiki communities, or just like gay family, dynamics and communities. Those are these unique communities that are typically kind of unique to sexual and gender minority persons of color, especially in New York City, especially like in Upper Manhattan and other parts of the city where, these communities with like a long history of survival is out there, and they have these big impacts. And just knowing that they orient themselves a little different than folks may understand, gay or queer spaces. Find folks who are cis gay or lesbian or bisexual, but also folks who are trans, folks who are non-binary. You see a lot of diversity in these spaces. You see folks, of different experience centered and welcomed. These social networks, they provide social and financial support. They provide food access, shelter, mutual aid, protection from physical harm, and also just access to resources and services. When we're having these conversations and discussions, to understand that these social and sometimes sexual networks, they're vital features of wellness. There's some communities that have really had to rely on these networks that when, some of the kind of failed safety net institutions would exclude them or would not be as welcoming. And that said, I think it's really important to think about what it means to be trauma-informed. And, trauma-informed care is we've been aware of and using in a medical practice and in mental and behavioral health spaces. But when we're talking to the community, I think the big takeaway is just knowing that more often than not, folks have experienced something, and instead of like, oh, what's wrong with them versus like, what's happened? What have they been through? And I think that is a way for us to really understand and really open up a conversation versus, doing the blame game. And the reality is that many folks in the community, in the LGBTQ community, have experienced multiple forms of trauma in their lifetime. And, the reactions and responses to that trauma can manifest in very different. So when we're thinking about providing affirming care or, being affirming, or being in community with folks, we want to just make sure that, that we're conscious, that we are caring, and we know that, and have a sensitivity, and just know that sometimes, some change is required to make folks feel, accepted or seen. That kind of just comes with it. The world isn't always such a nice and accepting place. Sexual histories, our sexual health is part of our overall health. For folks who do engage in sex, as a part of, natural human behavior, I think it's really important to know that it's part of it. And when, you go to the provider, you go to the doctor, that they're not just asking for, for their own health, they're asking for yours. And I think we think about the LGBTQ community, but for all communities, there are many different parts, of our overall health that are impacted by our sexual history. And unfortunately, there are some health disparities or inequities that affect sexual and gender minority populations related to sexual health. There's a lot of folks typically when we kind of avoid asking those questions, we don't really understand that some folks may need additional primary care recommendations or screenings or more testing more frequently based on their sexual history. I think a lot of folks make presumptions, just knowing where, how or where to test for STIs, which vaccines are indicated or not, who should be thinking about birth control and the type of sex that they have and the type of anatomy that they have, or even just HIV, prevention or treatment, all of that is you can really get the best recommendations from taking a good sexual history. We just know that it's just really underdone. And so you really want to normalize that and have folks know that, take a beat, take a pause. When you go to the provider, it's important to kind of be truthful and to kind of answer these questions because they're trying to get at potential recommendations or more tailored recommendations based on your history. So it's really important. So talking about sexual practices, I won't go too deep into this, but just knowing that when we talk about sex, you want to have a big, open mind about what sex means for different folks, that sex isn't always just penetrative. So just wanted to name that and identify that there's all types of different of sex. And so, if we're providers or if we're going to talk to our providers to bring up some of these questions and talk about the type of sex that you engage in, some folks who may engage in, may not engage in penetrative sex, but there may be some benefits for certain things that folks can do to either a bit more safely or some other things that folks can do to kind of have the conversation with a partner to educate yourself or others. So just wanted to name that. And even when we're talking to young folks or counseling folks, thinking about how folks are meeting partners, having that conversation and letting folks know, the world isn't always safe. So just having folks have an awareness, if you are going to meet folks in certain places, may benefit you from, bringing condoms if you're going to engage in any kind of penetrative sex, or bringing other kind of things for protection, or just knowing what your limits or boundaries are before you go into the place. So just really wanted to just raise awareness of that. The sex can look many different ways. Dating apps. Dating apps are a big part of dating in New York City, but especially when we're talking about folks in the LGBTQ community, we know that some younger folks definitely are on the app. So we just want to just name the apps and have an awareness for the apps, especially if we're going to have conversations about sexual health. Just know that apps should be part of the conversation. So just pointing out, most of the apps are the cell phone based online geosocial dating app. Basically, you can download these things on your phone and you can connect to folks based on distance. Present in many different models. There's dozens right now, but basically using GPS technology, you can locate other users, exchange pictures, messages, voice notes, etc., and really establish virtual or in-person connections. Dozens of apps. Certain apps are kind of more tailored for certain communities. There's a whole app lingo that you want to make sure that if you're going to be on the app or be working with younger folks, to make sure that they kind of have an update and know what they're getting into, or just know that there's a different way to navigate these apps. But basically the apps kind of present in a few different kind of base models. So you kind of look on the top, this is one of the most popular apps called Grindr. It kind of presents as the grid. So you kind of see, just different collections of faces based on location. So by proximity, you can kind of click on a profile and learn more. You can share, where you are, where you want to meet up, etc. And then there's below, there's a model that's just like the swipe model, kind of based on Tinder or these kind of other models where basically, if you want to match with someone, you can't really talk to them until you match. So you either swipe left or whatever, the swipe or hard or whatever to say that you like someone. And if you both like each other, you can match and talk. So there's many different ways that folks can communicate. But again, just, healthy app navigation is a part of a sexual health conversation. And that said, it's not just, we're not just asking around awareness or what apps are you using? There's some recommendations for how you can be on apps safely. I got this from GMHC, the Gay Men's Health Crisis, from their website. I think it's a really important tool just to really, review with folks, making sure that folks bring condoms or lube with them. These are how they're risk reduction techniques, decide what's safe. What are you into? What's safe? What are your boundaries before you go? Trusting your gut, letting folks know that you don't have to be so polite in some of these situations. If something doesn't look right, you can just respectfully get yourself out of a situation. Don't be afraid to leave or say no at any time. If you're drinking, don't leave things unattended. But tell someone if you're going someplace. Tell someone to keep an eye out, carry a cell phone. And then also folks can just think about other kind of risk reduction, meeting in a public place before taking anything to another level. These are all things that we recommend. To the right of the screen, I want to share their sexual health resources across the city. At our city's sexual health clinics, we're expanding our services, on women's health. And, I like to add because it kind of really gets to like how people are talking now, and not being so closed off and just knowing, this is a reality, people do date, and so I kind of I like the imagery, with the emojis or everything else. For the last section, I just wanted to give some history and some background around healthcare, the healthcare system, and folks who identify as LGBTQIA. First, by starting about healthcare and homosexuality in particular. For much of our history, there's been these official pronouncements on the meanings of what it means to engage in same-sex behaviors or identify, as queer, gay, or lesbian. And a lot of those were informed by religious groups. And there was basically this kind of bigger kind of understanding or this message that homosexuality is deemed as morally bad. So in the 19th century or in the 1800s, the culture had shifted, away from some of the religious or secular authority, but we see the impact still. But we also kind of see how it's kind of how the language of sins or these kind of moral sins have shifted, but we also see how the law, medicine, psychiatry, and these other kind of forms have kind of taken the conversation. In some places, I think we've seen it advanced to be more inclusive, but we've also seen how some of the dialogue or discussion has actually kind of, gone a bit more retrograde. I think important to know is that it wasn't until the year 1973 that the American Psychiatric Association officially removed the diagnosis of homosexuality from their diagnostic and statistical manual. So up until the year 1973, homosexuality was categorized as a mental disorder for the psychiatric community. 1973. It wasn't that long ago that we saw that shift. The image to the right is a historical image from the 72 American Psychiatric Association conference. And in that year, the American Psychiatric Association, the question of homosexuality was brought before the group. You see the people to the left, these are some prominent gay rights, Frank Kameny and Barbara Giddings. They came in and testified, and you see the person, Dr. H. Anonymous. He was a practicing psychiatrist who could not come out or live his true identity because he was at risk of losing his license and being barred from practicing medicine because of his homosexual identity. So, to protect himself, he wore this big, I think it's a Nixon mask and a whole big oversized outfit to go and testify and just basically just say, that we are people, that we are human, there's nothing wrong with us. And it really applied this pressure to push the American Psychiatric Association to reconsider and to change its language and its stance on pathologizing folks who engage in same-sex behavior, same-gender loving behavior, to really see it as an expansion of the breadth of human sexuality versus something pathological and disordered. The medical sciences and our relationship to folks in trans health, because unfortunately we are very delayed still. So if you kind of see, 1973 was when homosexuality was taken out from the manual and wasn't seen as a pathology or mental disorder. But you can see in the 80s, transsexualism is a way that they describe folks with trans identity, down to gender identity disorder, and then to gender identity disorder another way. So it wasn't until the year 2013 that there was a shift from the disconnect, the disalignment between the gender that folks may have been assigned at birth versus the way that they see and understand their identity. Gender identity wasn't in the year 2013, so about 10 years ago, where the language was able to shift and capture the fact and name the thing that is off is not their identity, but just naming what's going on. And if there's a dysphoria, the fact that someone is assigned an identity that does not align with who they are, their values, and how they see and understand themselves in the world. And I think that was a major shift, but you can see, in the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more, but there are major implications for care. And I think the main takeaway is that we don't want that gender diversity should not be seen as pathology. It should be seen as an expansion and an elevation of really bringing in a beautiful range of how humans engage with each other and are in relationships. As I mentioned before, since the year 2020, there's been just a steady rise in anti-LGBTQ legislation, moving from across states, across the country. Folks have seen record numbers, like over 200 pieces of legislation have gone up in the country. And we think about all these anti-LGBTQ lawmakers, there's television pundits, there's other public figures who are pushing these old retrograde tropes, mischaracterizing folks in the community, particularly gay men, but also trans women, as dangerous, as sex and child abusers, as groomers. And we just know that that's not the case. space. We kind of see, these wedge issues are created to kind of cause division and to really isolate smaller communities or communities that may not have the political power to really speak up for themselves on the same level or the same platforms. And all of this has really just contributed to these upticks, these just increases in violence against folks in the community, of threats of violence, not just slurs at work or et cetera, but we've seen this translate to these kind of like mass shooting attacks. We see arson across the city. We see all of these attacks. And so, none of this is happening in a vacuum. And so when we're talking about just the bigger understanding of where we are, that's these messages of really opening up the conversation and really understanding the community and the rightful place of the community in our city, in our society is so important. And we see folks coming under attack. I think the main takeaways for the presentation today are, our sexual health is an integral part of our overall health. Sexual health is important. It's just as important as our mental health, which is just as important as our physical health, which is just as important as our community health. All of these are dynamics of our humanhood and have an impact on our health and well-being. And so sexual health is part of it, and we can't shy away from that aspect of our lives. Language and culture are always evolving. We gotta, do our best to keep up, be open and willing to be educated or to learn new things. It doesn't have to be seen as morally wrong if you don't know something. It's important that we name and consider intersectionality and knowing how, that the dynamics of multiple layered societally reproduced disadvantages and advantages can impact folks and their well-being, and just knowing that there's a lot of diversity and just making space for that and looking at our differences as things to rejoice and to gain and that can be gained, that can be looked as like a bonus versus something to be scared of. Marginalization is an active process. We must all actively work to undo. We want to make sure that we center folks, who the society will try to brush to the sides or diminish or say they're not the mainstream or they're not this or they're not that. We want to really make sure that, as a community, we hold up all of our members and everyone deserves a seat at the table and deserves some decency, and respect and good health. And then finally, we really have to work with our communities and really see our communities as part of the solution, not just this problem. The solution comes from us in the communities doing the work. It's not just waiting for someone to come out, someone from the mountains to come and save us. I don't know if there's a cavalry coming. It's all, it's us. We are definitely the ones that we've been waiting for.
Thank you so much, Dr. Watkins. I think that was so much great information, and especially as you're saying, as some of the threats against the LGBT community and especially trans people recently have been really sort of, like you say, retrograde. It's like we're going back to these narratives that are very old and tired and have been proven untrue, and yet they're gaining some traction right now, which is really upsetting. One thing I was thinking along the way is just that, the underlying thing of like happy and celebrating diversity is such a thing. It's like, to check your impulse to be scared of things that are different than, what your experience is, and how central that sort of is to the SMART community, and also to a lot of communities that we inhabit. There's a real sort of specific attack on medical resources for trans youth. That has been sort of a widespread thing that we've seen. And he's wondering if the Department of Health has any sort of statistic or information that could help us kind of combat the misinformation that's being shared about healthcare specifically for trans youth.
There are a lot of resources and advocacy groups out there. None of them I'm affiliated with, but there's a lot out there. If folks really want to see, Human Rights Campaign is a big one. They do a lot of advocacy. I think for folks who kind of want to be engaged, want to learn more, really searching online and really connecting and kind of seeing folks who are doing the work, and then to tap in. There's a lot of work going on locally that if folks really do want to learn more and kind of tap into or support, that you can. There's a lot of work, for like women's reproductive health rights, with Planned Parenthood and other things. There's a lot of work that is going on. And New York City, we have we're doing a lot of work. And I think also locally, proud to say, there are a lot of folks who are setting up pathways for folks who may not live in New York City, so they can come in and receive some of these necessary and life-saving medical services.
Yeah, because we see that a lot of this has been very state focused right now.
Yeah.
So, some states like New York were really, especially New York City, we're really lucky, and really sort of, not lucky is maybe not the right word, but blessed, I don't know, to have this sort of supportive people in power. And some other states do not have that. And the LGBT community, especially the trans community, especially trans youth, are really suffering under that kind of bigotry. So we appreciate very much the work that you're doing. You know, we've made a lot of gains, but I think also right now is the time where we're really sort of battling a lot of bigotry and really backwards attitudes about LGBT communities. So we want you to just be aware and think about how you can contribute to the acceptance and the celebration and the, just welcoming of everybody, of all experiences, all gender identities, all sexual orientations.
At the end of the day, whatever we can do to really have this conversation about community, we need community. And we shouldn't be throwing anyone out just because we may not understand or identify with them. I think it's what can we do to be open and bring folks in, because we have a lot of work to do, to keep our community safe, to respond to all of the things going on. We need everyone. So we got to really think about how we can be in community with each other. So yeah.